Good afternoon, everybody. I know people are still coming in, but we might as well start on our merry way here this afternoon. Um, this afternoon's chat, which is Where is the West in Canada, is the first in a series JSGS is hosting this year on the general theme of kind of the state of getting it off on with home field advantage, as it were. Uh, Basically, want to understand where our region is at as things change around it. My name's Jim Farney, the Regina director of Johnson Shoyama, and I will be playing a more actively and engaged moderator than usual, since I will be moderating and trying to say something about Saskatchewan as we move through. I'm joined by my colleague Lisa Young from the University of Calgary, who will be trying to make sense of Alberta for us. And without taking up too much of the afternoon's time, and Royce Koop from Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, who will be making Manitoba interesting, he promises us. So welcome to everybody who signed on. Welcome to my two colleagues. I'm joining from Treaty 4 today. The school operates on Treaty 6 as well. Both sites are the homelands of the Métis, and I think, well, the numbered treaties are different. That's true for all of us joining today. The focus of our conversation today, we think, will mostly be provincial and national politics, but it's obvious that making something good and meaningful out of land acknowledgements is a significant governance challenge for the West, and perhaps something for another conversation with a different panel some other time. But it's a topic we are glad to work on in partnership with First Nations University and with a number of First Nations and Métis partners. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda. Lisa, Royce, and I kind of have 5 minutes of thoughts on where each of our respective provinces are at this moment in time. We've got some questions between ourselves to kick things off after that, and then I'll start keeping an eye for questions from the audience about 15 or 20 minutes in. The easiest way to get a question to me is to just submit it to Jim Farney in the Zoom chat, and I will do my best to post and moderate and pull things together as we go. If you do have any logistical questions during today, please send a note to Karen Jaster-LaForge, either in Zoom or by email at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. We are recording today. It'll be up on our YouTube channel in a week or so if you really feel like you want to go back and review and remit. So with all of that preliminary stuff, let's start by kind of taking a little bit of an overview of where each of the provinces are at. As I said off the top, my challenge today is that both Lisa and Alberta are so bloody entertaining right now, it will be hard to make it not an Alberta panel. But Lisa, I think we might as well let you take it off because it's been an interesting week.
It's always an interesting week in Alberta. Thanks so much for the introduction, Jim, and for the invitation to come and talk about Alberta and the West in Canada at the moment. And so when I think about sort of where things are in Alberta right now, there are two stories, I think, that are quite disparate from one another. The first is the one that probably everyone is aware of on this webinar. We understand that there will soon be a memorandum of understanding, a peace agreement, I guess, between the government of Alberta and the federal government. The leaks that have come out this morning suggest that the federal government is in some way, shape, or form going to endorse the idea of a pipeline to the West Coast. And I think it's already come out that many of the regulations around greenhouse gas emissions, Danielle Smith's 9 bad laws that the federal government has passed, are going to go away. And so there's going to be this agreement. We don't know the details. We don't know how firm the federal commitment to a pipeline is. Certainly there are many barriers to a pipeline, but A lot of Alberta's politics obviously is focused around this question of getting oil to tidewater, and so this is going to be, I think, in many ways, the dominant conversation in Alberta. So that's one story. The other, and obviously this is a story where Premier Smith will claim credit, and I think with some reason for doing so, of getting this entirely new deal for Alberta. So on that issue, things are looking good for Danielle Smith and the Smith government. Then there's domestic politics, and here we see the Smith government in a fair bit of hot water at the moment. Over the last number of weeks, something has shifted in Alberta politics. There's a Leger poll that suggests that public opinion is shifting. The government's decision to use the notwithstanding clause for the first time in Alberta to legislate striking teachers back to work has been extraordinarily controversial. It has been followed up by an announcement yesterday to use the notwithstanding clause again to protect the legislation relating to trans issues. So 3 different pieces of legislation it will be used on. And so there's a lot of pushback there, particularly, in the cities, which is an area of electoral weakness for Smith and the UCP. The sort of slow drip of stories around healthcare continues. There's supposed to be an Auditor General's report coming out today about an effort to privatize lab testing. So on all of those bread and butter issues of provincial governments, healthcare, education, there's a lot of sort of growing discontent with the performance of the Smith government. And just to entertain us all, it's being played out in part with something called Operation Total Recall, which is an effort to use the UCP's own recall legislation to recall UCP MLAs. And I don't think it's going to be successful, but it has unsettled the government to a significant extent. So as always, there's lots to talk about in Alberta. I hope I haven't taken more than 5 minutes there.
Great, Lisa. Royce, what's up in Manitoba?
Okay, yeah. Thanks also to Jim for the introduction and to the school for inviting me to this. I like the way that Lisa framed that. The kind of the outward-looking politics of Alberta, then the inward-looking. I think in Manitoba, the bigger questions are inward-looking. When I was thinking about how I would answer this question earlier, I came up with the term that Manitoba politics now are characterized by the kind of parochial concerns of a have-not province. Very what Lisa called bread and butter issues in the provinces. I think the political context, which I'll mention first, is that we're now a little over 2 years out from the last election here, in which we had a very unpopular incumbent PC government that ran a very controversial campaign and was defeated by Wab Kinu's NDP. The NDP is very popular. They had a lot of goodwill coming into government. And now that we hit the 2 year mark, we have seen a shift in the kind of small amount of media that we have in this province. Because suddenly we want to see some output. We want to see something happening as a result of getting a new government. And so some of the coverage has shifted, and that's particularly true with, I think, probably the 2 big policy areas that people are focused on right now, which is healthcare, and then a suite of issues related to encampments and homelessness and drug use. But in terms of healthcare, in the last election campaign, the NDP ran maybe the most disciplined election campaign in the history of the democratic world. Every single day of the campaign, Wab Kinew and the NDP made an announcement about healthcare. It was, we're going to move a bed into the hospital in Winkler. Every single day, the journalists had nothing, they had no alternative but to report on healthcare. And so the NDP was faced pretty high expectations, and now we're starting to see that things are not really improving on all the kind of classic measures that journalists report on. They give us updates on wait times in emergency rooms. Things aren't really improving, and so the government has made this argument they're investing in staff recruitment. We're going to see the output of that eventually, but for now, we're not seeing that. And increasingly, the government is under a lot of pressure as a result of these health issues. The other is this suite of issues related to drug use, a proposed consumption site, encampments, which are an issue, especially in Winnipeg. This is another issue in which I think the government is struggling. They did want to open a consumption site. They faced significant pushback from people in that neighborhood. There was accusations they hadn't consulted properly, and so that got canceled. Now it's getting moved, and so there's a real kind of drumbeat of news about these kinds of issues. Government struggling to deal with, and just kind of the wider concern about crime in Manitoba is a big thing. In Manitoba, I think there's two bigger issues that'll be of interest to this audience in particular that relate to both of these. And the first is that in Manitoba, accomplishing anything in an environment of comparable scarcity compared to Saskatchewan and Alberta, it really does kind of change our politics. The government can only do so much. It has very limited resources, and so, as someone that moved to Manitoba almost 15 years ago, I grew up in Alberta and in British Columbia. This is something that to this day kind of amazes me. The government just does it has to make real decisions. There's actual scarce resources in Manitoba. It just can't do the things that it necessarily wants to do. And the second thing is that in Manitoba, we do kind of have an issue related to the capacity of politicians to do the things they want to do, and to do the things that they promise to do. Manitoba is a place, I'd imagine other kind of have-not provinces are like this, but where the premier snaps his fingers and nothing happens. And so he's got to call another meeting. And then he's got to lean on his minister and haul in bureaucrats. And, you have to have the kind of tenacity of Brian Pallister to get things done. And I think that adds a real kind of distinctive element to our politics in Manitoba that is maybe not present in a place like Alberta or Saskatchewan. And being Premier of Alberta is hard for other reasons, but not for this reason. This strikes me as a kind of Manitoba thing and maybe a have not province thing. So I'll probably return to this, but I think I think I've used my 5 minutes.
Yeah, if I can take kind of Royce's last observation, and I'll start with policy and then talk a little bit about partisan stuff. One of the interesting features of Saskatchewan under the Saskatchewan Party governments is we've had these consistent 10-year growth plans. So there's these long-run strategic plans for the province's economy that are supposed to guide provincial decision making. Our current one will end in 2030, and so there's some thinking already about what comes next. And in both of the plans that cover the last 20 years, essentially, at its core has been an internationally focused export-led economic model where with significant population growth. And that combination would lead to economic growth that outstripped population. What we've had for the last decade is population growth outstripping the economy. And so when you look at education, when you look at healthcare, we have more people in the province, we do have a growing economy, but the pressures on the state are growing faster than the resources it has to meet with them. And so I think it will be an interesting question as we move forward, how we moderate that. And it does lead, especially in healthcare and education, in ways that have rolled over into partisan politics, something like the dynamic Royce is talking about, where there are just not enough dollars to go around. And the consistent challenge especially on the health human resources side, that every time Alberta ups wages, we lose people. And so Saskatchewan's obviously not a have-not province, but there is a little bit of that dynamic in our day-to-day. And I think watching that as things move forward will be interesting. On the partisan side, to people from outside the province, we probably look pretty stable. We had a provincial election last fall. The NDP did better than it has in 20 years. It took every seat in Saskatoon and Regina. There was a very narrow pathway to them forming a government that didn't close. And so I think both parties are pretty keenly aware that we're once again a competitive provincial environment. There had been rumors all summer that Premier Mo would be using the Sask Party convention this fall to announce his departure from politics. Instead, he's announced that he's continuing on and planning to lead the party into the next election. So on the Saskatchewan party side, I think there's a lot of continuity. And the NDP seems to have found its way into a pretty decent organizational place in a kind of prairie populist, relatively small government, pro-union sort of spot. Pro-development, pro-resource development, but nevertheless very much in that pragmatic tradition. There's also been a lot of kind of chatter for the last couple of years about a threat from the right on the Saskatchewan party, either at the level of challenges to MLAs in their constituencies for riding nominations, or kind of a UCP challenger. And there's been a couple of different iterations of parties from the right or even separatist side of things challenging them. I think that's both of those have largely been seen off. So what we have is a pretty managerial conservative party with some, they passed legislation on trans kids in schools last year. They occasionally move in a populist direction, but fundamentally managerial, squaring off against, I would argue, fairly managerial NDP. And the challenge is what direction those two go in. So at the partisan level, I think things are definitely quieter than Alberta, and we don't have the sort of significant shift that Manitoba has just moved through. The last piece I'll say goes back to the international angle on the growth plan, and this might be the kind of starkest difference. We are starting to see kind of a relative diminishment of Saskatchewan's oil and gas industry. There's a lot of appetite around nuclear and being part of the energy superpower story because of moving to nuclear, but oil and gas is not as big as it once was. And the hit to especially canola, but agriculture generally, because of counter tariffs from Asia, have rendered the province's position on the Trump tariff stuff very complicated, because it's seen that agriculture is being unjustly punished for decisions made to help Central Canada. It's maybe part of a traditional regionalism story. Which kind of leads into the first question we'd framed for ourselves, and in some ways it's analytic and political sciencey, and in some ways it's personal. So Royce grew up in BC and landed in Manitoba. I grew up in Alberta and have landed here. Lisa's a Winnipeg expat in Calgary. And one question that we're not sure of the answer, but I'll throw it to Royce first, is can we speak of the West as a cohesive region anymore, the way that all of our Canadian politics textbooks led us to think that we did? We just gave the summary of the three provinces. Should we still be talking about them as a region?
Yeah, I think in terms of the kind of party political stuff, increasingly we can. I didn't talk about the PC party in my little introduction, but PC's had a rough election. They've gone through a leadership selection process. They have a leader now, and we've basically moved to a two-party system. The provincial Liberal Party is really kind of out for the count. The NDP ate their lunch in the last election. I don't really think we're going to see any revival of the provincial Liberal Party, and so in Manitoba now we have a party of the center left, a party of the sorry, I should say a party of the center right, and then the NDP. Sounds familiar? Alberta and Saskatchewan. So politically, there's a lot of commonalities between in terms of the system, the party systems between these three provinces. In terms of the real topical issues of the day, I'm not sure we can talk about our three provinces as a kind of cohesive region with shared interests. And in some ways, Manitoba is not an unreliable partner, but kind of an enigmatic partner, given the challenges of the moment. We've heard a lot from the provincial government of favoring big infrastructure projects. We heard talk about a port in Churchill. And so there's a lot of things in common, a lot of opportunities for the provinces to work together. But then when the rubber hit the road, we saw something else. This past July, there was that MOU about an energy corridor that was signed by Daniel Smith, Scott Moe, and Doug Ford. And Wapkanu didn't sign it. He didn't want to be a part of that. Now, the stated reason for that was that as it was written, the Premier Canoe didn't think there was enough consultation with Indigenous people at the front end. But there's another reason for that as well. The premier is facing some real pressure within his own party, within his own coalition over environmental concerns. We actually had one party official leave the party because said, "Well, all this talk about pipelines, like why did I work for the NDP? Why didn't I just work for the PCs if we're going to be kind of throwing concerns about the environment by the wayside?" And so, the big thing at the moment that's different about Manitoba is we have an NDP government surrounded by center-right governments of different names, and I think that's going to be reflected in this kind of this enigmatic partnership with the provinces around us.
Thanks, Royce. Lisa, what does it look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty skeptical of the notion of there being something called the West for a number of years now. And, we can all harken back to the time when there was, a true sense of the four Western provinces as a cohesive, somewhat cohesive region within Canada, that it meant something when you said the West or, Preston Manning, the West wants in. Um, British Columbia now we haven't even talked about, right? I mean, it has, it is truly the West in geographic terms, and we don't think of it sociologically or politically as really being part of the political bloc that we might talk about on the prairies. Although certainly, when we think politically, there's parts of interior BC that bear more similarity to Alberta than they do to the lower mainland. But the lower mainland is just doing its own thing, right? So then we're left with these three other provinces, and I agree with Royce. Manitoba is its own entity. I saw something this week that sort of talked about Manitoba as maybe being a maritime province now that was going to have a port in Churchill. And in terms of its politics, the party system absolutely is consistent across the three prairie provinces, but in terms of that politics of scarcity, the politics of being a have-not province, Manitoba does have more in common with New Brunswick or Nova Scotia than it does with Saskatchewan or Alberta. And so then we're left with, two provinces that have really formed, in many ways, a relatively coherent bloc within Confederation. Justin Trudeau was very helpful to the sense of cohesion between these two provinces. Nothing like having a common enemy, a sense that, all of the environmental regulations were targeted, unfairly at these two regions, that, it didn't take into account everything from how we heat our houses to the kinds of politics that we have. And so, to the extent that we can think about the West in that historical term, I think it is Alberta and Saskatchewan. And even there, Jim's point about, oil and gas becoming less significant, there are some wedges appearing between those two. And Alberta is absolutely, capable and content to, be its own thorn in the side of Canada on a whole range of issues, right? While calling itself the West. So does the West exist? I think not really in the way that we used to think of it.
Yeah, and to me, it's funny because you can see it kind of this fractal thing in terms of national level results or the two-party systems in each of the provinces. There's a lot of commonality. Um, so long as there is a liberal government in Ottawa, there'll continue to be some sense of alienation, even if it's muted with the NDP in Manitoba, but I'm sure it's still there. Um, I think there is far more in common in the political economy of Saskatchewan and Alberta than there is in Manitoba, and I think that drives a lot of the difference. And the other thing, and I will be kind of curious to see how Carney's governing style changes or shifts this. If you look just at demographics and kind of mass behavior, what you really have is an Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg set of commonalities surrounded by a whole lot of geography with relatively few people who look the same, right? And the urban-rural split in Trudeau's way of managing the Federation, where there was outreach to municipalities and a lot of downloading to NGOs, I think maybe pulled that apart more. I think Carney's pulled us back into a more traditional view of federalism where the provinces are the preeminent actors. There are, clear differences between the three of them, but at least they're all agreed who's at the table. And I think we just went through a decade where that was less clear, and that maybe broke the political actors up a little bit in the prairies. But yeah, at most, it seems to me it's a Saskatchewan sort of plus Alberta. And to me, the biggest difference is, yes, Saskatchewan's a have province, but it's a very small province. There's no pretense that we can change the shape of the federation, whereas Alberta certainly still believes it can change the rules of the game.
You're Robin to our Batman.
Exactly. Yes. But okay, sorry, I won't go back to the 1960s TV show. That could be bad. The last really big question that I think we had set ourselves in advance was how our respective provinces are approaching the Canada-US story and this resurgence of geopolitics and all the considerations that go with it. I think Danielle Smith has made the most vocal of the three premiers. So Lisa, I'll let you start on this one.
Yeah. So, Smith has, she set the tone with her trip to Mar-a-Lago before Trump was sworn in. And since then has been pretty consistent in being the voice that, says that Canada shouldn't should keep its elbows down, should make nice. She has absolutely been the proponent of that approach to the Canada-US relationship. It has, in some ways, it's been easier from an Alberta perspective to make that case. Alberta didn't get hit with the same rates of tariffs. Alberta isn't facing the same sort of existential threat to industry that Ontario is facing, not facing the softwood lumber issues and so on. So Smith has occupied this place, which early on in the Trump administration really had her out in right field essentially, and as things have continued, it has seemed like a more mainstream position, and one where the prime minister, I think, has come around to some extent to that point of view. And so, the whole situation that we're in with the Americans, I think, changes Alberta's role in the country in some significant ways. And I think Smith is making the most of it. We're now the stable source of revenue because our main export isn't threatened in the same way that other exports are threatened. To the extent that there's going to be significant economic pain elsewhere in the country, the ability of Alberta taxpayers to continue paying in is going to be essential. And there is this sort of lingering discussion of Alberta separatism. It's that threat in the background, with the Americans presumably being, enthusiastic proponents of it if push came to shove. And so that's the knife that can be held to the throat of the federal government at the end of the day. So Alberta's, for pursuing its own interests, Alberta is now in an enviable position, I think.
Yeah, so for Manitoba, we don't have the benefit of being a big province like Ontario that has to be listened to, but we also don't have the benefit of being a place like Alberta, where there's actually kind of a cohesive, coherent message that we can express. Yeah, the Manitoba government's message has been slightly confused, which reflects the kind of difficult position that Premier Canoe is in. An NDP premier, much the same as the premier of BC, an NDP premier with significant environmental commitments, commitment to people concerned about climate change, who is governing in a moment when everyone is talking about the need to export to non-US countries, to build infrastructure, to build pipelines. I think in a general sense, when this provincial government's forays into national politics have not really been successful. And so we have seen some attempts at that. I think the most recent was the government kind of jumped on the notwithstanding clause bandwagon a while ago. The premier said, "I'll never use the notwithstanding clause." They introduced legislation, and then a week later, we got the ruling from the Supreme Court that struck down mandatory minimums on child porn offenses. And so the next day, he was like, "Well, maybe we would, and we need to use it in the right way." And so it didn't work out. And so, yeah, a smaller province, I think there's just less room for the government of Manitoba to participate in these bigger conversations. And when they have done so, it hasn't worked out. In Manitoba, there's a kind of sense that uh, we have problems here that the provincial government should be dealing with, and the province should not be distracted by some of these bigger issues.
I'd say the Saskatchewan story has been, we are finding it much easier to work with the federal government in the Trudeau to Carney transition. That seems to be sunnier on a lot of files. Where things have been more complicated, especially around tariffs, is I would say the Saskatchewan experience has been that this notion we can diversify away from the US actually uh, doesn't necessarily solve problems. So by way of anecdote, I was emceeing the Minister of Agriculture in a town hall meeting with all of the municipal reeves from the Rural Municipal Association last spring, the week after China's canola tariffs went in. And it was a room of 400 people who were very angry about Trump, very concerned about patrols on the border, but looking at what those tariffs were doing to their expected fall receipts and going, this is a more important policy problem for us. Given the importance of agricultural exports, given the challenges that we are having diversifying potash exports to new and emerging markets, um, given the importance of nuclear, which has an American partner to the province's energy ecosystem going forward, my read on the tariff thing is it's like there the problem is not just the US. The problem is this shift to kind of a nationalist geopolitics, and it's hurting us in lots of places. And the kind of Ontario-centric um, logic that we can just punch back and get cars running again just doesn't fly. So I, that's a very policy wonkish way to put it, but I think that's actually where the discussion is at. It's pretty wonky at the moment, more than popular. So I'm seeing questions start to pop up in the chat, and I am going to encourage people to put their questions in the chat by making a threat. And the threat is in the absence of questions, Lisa, Royce, and I will devolve into an extraordinarily technical discussion of shifts in defining populism since the early 1990s. Nobody wants that to happen, including us. So the more questions we get from the audience, the safer we are from three political scientists becoming very arcane, and that's just not fun. So this first one is from a nursing colleague of mine, Janine Brown. Hey, Janine. Kind of two parts, the same theme, but first part's directed at Lisa. About a month ago, Danielle Smith directed her justice minister to introduce new legislation on medical assistance in dying safeguards, citing federal rules and safeguards were insufficient, despite strong popular opinion in the province supporting kind of the existing regime. Do you have a sense of where the parties land on that? And then to Royce and I, are there any similar discussions going on in Saskatchewan or Manitoba?
Yeah, I'll confess that this isn't something that I've followed closely. I've sort of seen bits and pieces. Uh, you know, I think there are two things to say here. The first is that there is a strand of social conservative thought in the province that is, by no stretch of the imagination, sort of dominant in the broader political culture, but it is significant within the UCP base, and so that means it matters. Watching the Smith government, if you want to predict where they're going to land on things, the first question is, where is the base? And quite often they will land with them, even if they're going to have to take some heat in the broader electorate. So that would be the first thing to say about this. The second thing to say is that on a range of issues, whether it's immigration or medical assistance in dying, if an issue can be portrayed as, a federal liberal issue, then it can be, you can build support for doing something else by saying, no, we need the made in Alberta approach to this, right? The rules from Ottawa, they don't reflect our values here. And so, it's entirely possible that the provincial government will come in with some proposed rules that will be out of line with what you see in much of the rest of the country, and that will be, defended as being, the made in Alberta answer to this.
No, I'm not familiar with any discussion about that here.
And yeah, I don't spend a lot of time on the healthcare file, so I haven't heard anything here. It's been interesting, like the Saskatchewan social conservative mobilization and the government's action notes on it have mostly been on education files, right? So pronouns in schools, sex ed in schools both were provincial election issues and a clear differentiator between the NDP and the Saskatchewan Party. By a lot of metrics, Saskatchewan is now Canada's most religious province. So I think it's an interesting question why there hasn't been kind of mobilization around, the sets of issues where that bumps up against medicine. At a guess, I think some of it would probably be really talking about Catholic hospitals operating within a clear, if changeable, legal framework. And that is somewhat distinct because both in terms of intra-Catholic politics and the kind of Protestant right from things that would be easy to mobilize people around. But it is a curious thing why it hasn't come up. The reason Saskatchewan's got referendum legislation is the Divine Government put it in place to use on abortion early 1990s, and it's just rarely been triggered since. So I don't have an answer, but it's a good puzzle. Laura asks, how do you think the export economic model has impacted Western provinces' identity and ability to be Canadian as compared to their, I'd say, the strength of their provincial identities?
It's a
I don't
great,
know.
but
It's a great question. In the Alberta context, it's so hard to think about this in terms of an export mentality, because it's about the importance of oil and gas, but especially oil, to the provincial economy and to its identity, right? And so, yes, it's an export, so that's another piece of this, but it's that, the essential role of oil and gas, as a marker of identity, that I think is really the place to start unpacking it in the Alberta case.
Yeah, it's a great question, which means I don't have a good answer. It's hard. You would think that it would be nationalizing, that facing these kinds of challenges, the tariffs would be nationalizing. Big national project. We need to reorient our export economy. In fact, that hasn't been the case. It's just highlighted regional differences in export markets. We saw Doug Ford just openly being critical of Danielle Smith, saying, "Well, she's only got the one commodity. This is easy for her. It's hard for a place like Ontario." I don't totally agree with that, but I think that illustrates, that this is actually this challenge is fragmenting, given differences across the Canadian economy and the Canadian export economy.
Yeah, and I think so. I'm gonna disagree with Royce, which I haven't done yet. And because as I was thinking of my answer to the question, I think some of how Saskatchewan has squared that is we export a lot of products, but we're not a very international population, right? In terms of percentage of immigration, but even if you look at travel patterns, like people in Saskatchewan tend to travel in Canada anyway. North Dakota is not that interesting. And so even though our economy is very globally exposed, it doesn't touch people's everyday lives or their professional lives that much. And like Calgary is obviously much more of an international hub, but Winnipeg's economy is built around being a transport location. And a lot more of, I think, the labor force is involved in trucking and rail transport and like the actual work of moving stuff around. Some of that's across borders. I think it's made the politics of it here pretty easy, but I wonder at how people see their careers and their lives story if there is something different between the big centers and the provinces that way. Uh, So I made a mistake with my threat because there's an economist in the audience, and of course he's taken it up. So thanks, Brett. So Jim, you've piqued my interest. How should we understand populism in the three provinces, and is it different? Dale Eisler argued in Saskatchewan we have it being opposed to the feds, or there is a left-wing argument from Enoch and Smith that we have an extractive populism, where us refers to Saskatchewan oil, gas, and coal workers, and them is the Trudeau Liberals. Climate policy is a clear fault line, and we now see the Saskatchewan government planning to disobey three national policies on coal, industrial carbon pricing, and clean electricity. From a climate policy perspective, Saskatchewan seems like the real outlier here in its decision not to follow federal law, even though the NDP has not quite made that argument. Yeah, if I can start, Brett, I think you're right on the policy side. I'm puzzled by our move back to coal. It just I think I understand a little bit of the political side of it, but I don't understand the technical piece in either the short or the long run. One way I've heard of describing populism here is that the way of describing it that makes the most sense to me is it's not a style of governing. It's a way of articulating dissatisfaction with Ottawa. And I think it's really interesting that the Saskatchewan Party has never really looked at changes to direct democracy or campaign finance or party finance, or they have a very traditional kind of view both of how the legislature ought to work and in its role in the political system. In a lot of ways, I would describe the party when it thinks domestically as almost an old-fashioned Tory party. right? It's a party of small businessmen and landowners from the rural parts of the province with a very high view of legislative primacy. There's not much kind of modern populism in that. It's that they're conservatives and they're pro-resource development, pro-primary industry. That makes them look populist some of the time. I think that's very different from the style of politics that you see in Alberta with Danielle Smith and the UCP and that whole mode there, even though they end up in the same place. I don't know if either of the three of us are great to answer this, but I do think there will be a growing split in the energy part of the story between the three provinces, and that's going to be a transition that all three of us wrestle with in different ways. It's not clear to me what the Saskatchewan political outcome is. Would a NDP government openly disobey federal law? Probably not. Would they have the same 15-year gap before we get nuclear online that they would have to fill somehow? Definitely yes. I think it's been a while since I've thrown the first response to Lisa, but this bundle of things I know is something you've thought a lot about and are actually trying to measure with some sort of precision.
Yeah, which is its own thing. So I think, in the Alberta context, you can't understand Alberta politics without talking about populism. And we have decades of the, sort of the notion of Ottawa as the elite, that the good people of Alberta are in opposition to. And that's been a very successful sort of political appeal for Alberta premiers over time. Then we have, this notion, I think, of extractive populism, that the good people are the people who work in these extractive industries, and that those who are threatening those extractive industries are the self-interested elite, that are in opposition to the people. And then I think we've had with COVID a third layer of populism added on top of that. And it's much more sort of the right-wing populism of the Trump movement, of some of the European right populist movements. And so it has played out. It's sometimes called epistemic populism, the idea that experts are the self-interested elite, in contrast to the common sense of the common people. And so that played out through, the movement protesting public health measures during the pandemic, the people protesting vaccine mandates, and that has remained a live element of Alberta politics to this day. We had to pay to get a COVID shot here this fall, as sort of a hangover of all of that. And so, these three have really sort of coalesced together. And the UCP, I think, really can't be understood except as a populist party, which is what leaves me scratching my head and trying to figure out how the Premier presents a memorandum of understanding with the not very populist Carney government. So, that's my puzzle now.
Yeah, Manitoba is not a province that we kind of see we attach to this populist tradition that Lisa's just described. I think that the way that Jim described the Sask Party is beautifully put, and it applies to the Manitoba PC Party, this kind of traditional progressive conservative party of rural councillors and mayors, not particularly ideological and not really, populist in the way that we see in the way that Lisa's describing the UCP. The interesting thing about populism in Manitoba right now is with the premier, and he's kind of like writing a new kind of maybe a new kind of populism here. An NDP premier who is talking about how we need to bury sex offenders under the under the jail, who openly criticizes criminal defense lawyers, who basically talks like Bill Vanderzam on steroids. This is a kind of a new thing that we're dealing with here, and so that's. I wish I had a long history of the kind of literature and theoretical understanding that Lisa has to draw upon, but I don't. It seems like we're getting something new here in Manitoba in Wad Canoe.
Willow asks a really good question that I'm going to try and summarize kind of into a follow-on this populism point, and it's getting at what's the interaction between an economy where there's a lot of resource extraction, a lot of big multinational corporation investment that causes all sorts of problems that go with that type of economy in terms of policy and social issues. But this more or less, because it's clear less dominant in Manitoba, language of the wisdom of the ordinary person. Like how is it that Alberta in particular manages to have both of those things at the same time? Lots of language about grassroots identity and knowledge, but a massive concentration of corporate power and investment. How do those two things get squared off?
Yeah. So, I think we need to go back and think about the I Heart Alberta Oil t-shirts, right? And that was an expression of Alberta extractive populism, right? That, the people wore t-shirts, they loved Alberta oil, these were the virtuous people. But this was not a grassroots movement by any stretch of the imagination, right? I mean, this is AstroTurf. The multinational corporations and the Alberta government have sort of joined together in convincing people that the interests of the people and the interests of multinational oil companies are one and the same. And it's been a remarkably successful effort, I think, from politically, and so we and the remarkable thing is the ongoing faith of the Alberta government, and I think significant segments of the Alberta electorate in this industry, which is cheerfully shedding jobs in as it automates, as it moves its headquarters elsewhere. And the enemy is never defined as these corporations, which is truly remarkable.
And I think to me, it's one of the tensions where the conventional language of populism or of left right, like, kind of starts to break down. I think there's a line of argument to say when it comes to kind of these political economy issues, the dividing line you see in the literature on populism. Some people talk about the distinction between somewheres and anywheres, and Mr. Harper picked it up in his memoirs, right? So the big multinational investors, the people that make their careers inside these companies, essentially the carny liberals, who take a global view of the movement of capital, are one faction of the Canadian elite. And the Pierre Poilievre, more populist faction, is a faction of smaller businesses, chamber of commerces, SMEs, farmers, people who are still wealthy, but they have a very different view of the scope of their opportunities and who's responsible for it. I think we have a colleague at the U of A named Jared Wesley who does focus groups with Albertans on how they define themselves. And he always gets people to draw a picture of an Albertan. And I love that 80% of the time, regardless of who's doing it, it's somebody that looks like me with a cowboy hat. Like, there is a massive disconnect between people's self-image of their province and what it actually looks like, that I think helps gloss this piece over. But I do, and if I don't think the existing party system really heightens that very, very clearly. This is a question that I've also been pondering a lot about, but I'm going to make Lisa and Royce answer first. Is there a distinctive theory of what the state and what it can do in each of the three provinces? Historically, each province innovated in state capacity in different ways, e.g. the CCF in healthcare. I would add in Lougheed and the oil sands, or you could add Manitoba Hydro. Like there are examples of big state-led innovation in each of them in the 50s and 60s and 70s. These days, it seems like Alberta is reorganizing its health system every second day, and Saskatchewan is flirting with the same thing. Manitoba Hydro is in some interesting places. You could add in other crowns here. Do we think there might be a shared logic at play? Are we anti-statist regions taking shots in the dark? Or is there a deeper level of thinking about what government can do going on?
And these are great questions. That's a really interesting question in the context of Alberta. Some of the contradictions in Alberta, people that profess to want a small state and yet want all the benefits of a quite expansive state. Um, I mentioned this right at the start. One of the things that is distinctive to me about Manitoba is that every benefit that the state provides in Manitoba, you have to pay for it somehow. And so there's an awareness in Manitoba that of the revenue versus expenditures. If we want something, if we want a healthcare system, that money has to come from somewhere, and that's a part of the conversation in a way that I don't want to draw caricatures, but in Alberta, there's just money. We're going to spend it on this, and we'll think about it later. Maybe we'll enter a bust period. But Manitoba, that's a kind of intrinsic part of the conversation of the politics of this stuff. And the direct response to your question is that as in Saskatchewan, there's a great deal of openness to collective action, to crowns, and hostility towards indications that those might get sold off or privatized. We don't really have debates about Manitoba Hydro. Are we going to sell off Manitoba Hydro? We have very interesting nitpicky debates between people about how it didn't snow enough last year, and so therefore we're going to run a big deficit because the money from hydro isn't enough. People, those are the kinds of conversations you have. By the way, we haven't had any snowfall in Winnipeg up until yesterday, and so I'm pretty sure the province is going to go bankrupt next year as a result of that.
Okay, well, that is this is an incredibly interesting question, and I'm not sure I've got a great answer to it, but just two things do come to mind. The first is when Jim was talking earlier, he talked about 10-year plans for Saskatchewan's government and the economy, and as he was talking, a 10-year wouldn't that be an interesting thing to have? Alberta does not have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. If we think about our plan for economic development, you can capture it in one word. We would like a pipeline, right? That is it's a single minded approach to this for an economy that's actually way more complex and multifaceted than you would think, right? So from that point of view, state capacity, there's no sense of the Alberta state planning for the economic future of the province in the way that a Peter Lougheed did back in the days when he invested in the development of the oil sands, right? And that was very much a state-led kind of undertaking. So that's the first thing I'd say. I guess the second thing, since the question related to privatization of healthcare and so on, I think we're seeing a shift toward renegotiating the fundamental deal in Alberta. And that fundamental deal historically, through the over the last 30 or 40 years has been that resource revenues take the place of tax dollars, and so we can have both low taxes and really enviable levels of public services. And it's been a great deal, don't get me wrong. But we've backed ourselves into a corner where we're so reliant on natural resource revenues for this that it's starting to look unsustainable. We're going to run a huge deficit, I think, this year, and all of these chickens are coming home to roost. And so what we're seeing is a turn not to, maybe we need to think about our tax rates or we need to think about a sales tax, but rather that it's not realistic to offer public services. What we need is to privatize. And this is where the Danielle Smith of 20 years ago, who was very much a liberal, neoliberal thinker on economic issues is coming into play. And so we're seeing public money going toward private schools, essentially trying to shift away from the unionized public education system into a subsidized, privatized education system. Now doctors are going to be able, there's a leaked memo that says that doctors will be able to practice in both the public and private systems simultaneously. So shifts toward privatization. So I think we're seeing the early stage of an effort to renegotiate that fundamental Alberta deal toward low taxes and relatively weak public services that affluent people can buy themselves out of.
I think that the state capacity question is really important, and it's one of my favorite books in Canadian politics is Richards and Pratt's Prairie Capitalism from 1979, and I think it's well overdue for an update. But I think Saskatchewan's actually in a really interesting place. I think when the Saskatchewan Party came into government in 2007, they had taken privatizing the big crowns anyway off the table for electoral reasons. I think Mr. Wall had a sense that good economic policy was both low taxes and diversifying revenue streams. So under his time in government, they deliberately reduced the provincial treasury's dependence on resource royalties because they were so unstable, and that worked out pretty well. I don't know if it's because of Mo or coinciding with him. There was a shift to see the state could lead in economic development, not necessarily by capital investment, although there's been a little bit of that, but because of the big crown sector being a single point of contact, and that was a competitive advantage, that it was easy to coordinate your access to power, water, zoning, mining permits, and that this could be part of this long-term Saskatchewan growth plan. So I think there has been a lot of distinctive thinking there. Where it's less clear to me is in social services and healthcare. And I think some of it is because the kind of big all-encompassing reform proposals, whether it's merging all the health districts into a single health authority, the lean initiatives of 2012, 13, 14 to kind of grassroots-ish astroturfy change the provisions in the system. Like just there's current stuff around some IT backend that's causing all sorts of problems. The pragmatic attempts at healthcare reform that this government have led have not worked. And so they haven't been able to kind of really massively bend the cost curve. And they're up against what I would describe as this kind of soft nationalism, right? There is a good argument that it would have been more cost effective to not build a children's hospital in Saskatoon, to ship people to Calgary or to Winnipeg. You can see that in cancer care. You can see this in the controversy around people going to Calgary for provincially paid MRIs. But we do just run into a scale and a capacity problem as a small province. And I don't see this government having thought carefully through how to resolve it. And the urban rural piece is really important. You have much different access to care in the rural settings than the urban ones, but nobody really wants to foot the bill. So the last piece, and I think this is more social services side, a lot of the services being provided in Saskatchewan are being provided under government contract by third parties, by charitable third parties or not-for-profit third parties. I don't know if that's more or less common here than in other provinces, but it lends a really kind of a different type of limitation on state capacity than we often talk about, right? The bureaucrats in the ministries are not the ones with a direct oversight. They're overseeing contracts, not operations. And there can be kind of an interesting dynamics there on some of this stuff. So I think we have a theory of the state for the economy. I don't think we have a theory of the social welfare state anymore. Here's a nice follow-on question. Do we have a theory of the state? We're not sure. Do we have a theory of the deep state? What is the relationship between the public service and the elected in the three provinces? What does the dynamic look like? Has it changed? Royce, this is not your recent book chapter, but there was recently an edited volume come out on Manitoba politics, and the chapter on the public service, I've got to say, was expecting significant changes in the relationship if there was ever a Tory to NDP transition. I'm wondering if that came to be at all, if the relationship between the public service and the government changed with the transition from the Tories to Mr. Canu's government.
It's hard for me to say. I don't. I mean, my sense is not really. In fact, Canu has a lot in common with Brian Pallister. They're both demanding premiers who put significant pressure on their civil servants, who take a direct approach. They actually intervene directly in individual ministers' portfolios. He kind of dips his toes in wherever he wants to. I think overall, probably morale is better under an NDP government than it was under the previous government. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't say that authoritatively.
Lisa, any like?
Yeah, I'm not close enough to this to say much authoritatively. There certainly has been, a pretty clear effort under Smith to put people in those DM roles who, can be expected to do what the premier's office directs. I think there was a suspicion of the public service, and I think that much of the public service is sort of a little bit shell-shocked by some of what has gone on. Where it's really, this doesn't get exactly at the public service, but basically, the provincial government, the premier's office is at war with the medical establishment, with the Alberta Medical Association, with everybody in managerial positions in what used to be Alberta Health Services and is now some sort of wild array. I think the happiest woman in Calgary is Carrie Tate, who writes for the Globe and Mail, and I think she gets up in the morning and picks which leak from the health sector she's going to publish that day. This is a sign of a situation where things have gone from bad to worse, and so it's more visible in healthcare where there's a lot of that activity. But I suspect that morale is pretty low in the Alberta public service.
Yeah, I went to undergrad with Carrie, and so every morning I open the paper up and chuckle and go, "My God, it looks like she's having fun." So obviously, given my day job, I am a friendly outsider to Saskatchewan Public Service. I think it's hard even in that role to see it without these moments of change, right? I think you either doing kind of serious studies and interviews of, you know, DMs and political staffers, or you just have a sense in the ether, and it's only when the winds really move that you can see. Um, but I think what I see is a public service and a party that have learned to work with each other. Right? There's not necessarily a natural affinity, but they've been working together for 15 years now. We've had, um, I would say, one almost complete generational turnover of cabinet ministers that happened in a pretty staged and incremental direction. Um, we've had two or three turnovers of senior political staff, with a couple of exceptions. There's still one or two guys left who started with Wall in senior roles, but it's been very much kind of a series of gradual transitions without shocks, and that means that both sides, I think, work together pretty well. Um, I do think there's a sense that the role of the public service was different under the NDP, but that's almost uh, I think that's almost a matter of individual leader styles more than uh, policy or ideology. Both Romano and Calvert were fond of getting deep into the weeds of policy in a way that Wall and Moore are much more interested in the details of communication. And I think I wouldn't call that a partisan comment. It's just different leadership styles. Um, see, two more questions here. One that we can probably all manufacture an opinion on, and then one that I don't know how to answer, but is an interesting assertion of provincial rights. So the second one first. Alberta is moving forward with a bill that purports to give them the ability to say what parts of international trade agreements do and do not apply in the province when parts fall under provincial jurisdiction. Might this have a substantive impact on international trade agreements, or is this another kind of call out to Alberta populists and kind of the dynamic around that we've talked about?
Yeah. I think it's a nothing burger. There's nothing in this bill that isn't already established in constitutional law, right? The federal government can sign whatever trade agreements or international agreements it wants, but implementation, they have to take into account areas of provincial jurisdiction, which is, the disconnect between the climate commitments that we make at the international level and the greenhouse gases that we emit. And we've had war for the past 10 years over efforts to use federal authority to address greenhouse gas emissions. But there has been no attempt to say, look, we've signed this agreement, therefore, we claim jurisdiction here, right? So this is just for show. I don't think it should be taken seriously at all.
There's no parallel legislation or effort in Saskatchewan. What I think is interesting on the international file is going back a decade now. There's been some pretty significant investment in international trade infrastructure. So trade offices abroad, the Ministry of Trade and Export Development does a lot of policy work on this stuff. Um, I think both the entities like the Provincial Chamber of Commerce and the provincial government are working more closely than they once did. Like, there does seem to be a provincial investment almost in a kind of diplomatic core light and international capacity light framing that's newish.
Yeah, it became a kind of significant short-term political issue when it was reported what the government was paying our envoy to Washington. I don't. There's no equivalent bills in Manitoba, and You can kind of see the political benefits of that bill priming the issue for Albertans if they're receptive to that, as Albertans are. It's politically advantageous. It would not be, there's nothing, those sentiments don't really exist in Manitoba, so there's nothing to prime. So I wouldn't expect to see that sort of thing here.
And I think what can be our very last question for the afternoon is we've talked a lot about the West and things going on and happening in the West. Are there actions that the federal government might take in Eastern Canada? The example is a high-speed rail link between Windsor and Montreal and investments therein, but we could pick funding for auto manufacturing or a massive copay on Ontario's Ring of Fire or money for Bombardier. Right? We've got lots of historical examples. Would there be especially sensitive issues that might coalesce and create Western resentment out here in terms of actions the feds could take of their own volition right now?
Are there things that they could do that would aggravate Western alienation?
Yeah,
Yeah, I could see that happening. I remember the CF-18 that was in Winnipeg, and so uh, Western alienation can certainly take root in Manitoba, just as in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I could see if there was a sense and a narrative that the federal government was being too doting on manufacturing interests in Ontario or the what's it called, the aerospace sector, things in Quebec, then that could certainly lead to that. I don't see a whole lot of that kind of dialogue happening outside of Alberta, to be honest. And it doesn't, I think an interesting thing, Lisa mentioned we didn't talk about BC. BC, you don't hear about Western alienation from BC. You hear it in a kind of interesting, unique way. You kind of have to look for it. But if there was going to be uh, concerns about Western alienation, it's really BC where it would matter, an actual battleground in federal
right.
politics. And so that's what I not mad at. I mean, on Alberta, is Alberta crucial to the federal Liberal electoral coalition? No. Is Manitoba? No. I mean, it's nice to have. It's not need to have. BC actually is. It's a battleground province, and yeah, I would be looking there. Uh, one little a long time ago, a political scientist we all know, Ken Cardy from Vancouver, went to Calgary to give a talk, and he started his talk by saying, "It's always nice to be in Eastern Canada."
Yeah, I'm I guess I'm truly an Albertan now because I'm going to bring this back to talking about a pipeline. So, when we think about BC, I mean, this is the piece of the puzzle that I just can't figure out, right? We hear that there's going to be this memorandum of understanding that the federal government is going to back the idea of a pipeline, and um, the premier of British Columbia is dead set against this pipeline, as are several Indigenous communities that would be affected, and so here I don't know if it's going to be articulated as Western alienation per se, but at some point, Carney is going to have to pick a side between Smith and Eby, and it sort of looks like he's picking Smith's side. I don't know, but I think that's going to be a really significant issue to watch. In terms of other sort of other things that might spark Western alienation, I do think that, when we think about the economics of what's going to go on over the next little while, and, the federal government is going to have to be bailing out industries, particularly in Ontario, or, spending money to help workers who are affected. And, we haven't complained much about equalization in Alberta for the last few years. It's been sort of a nice change. We've focused on pipelines, but I suspect that we will go back to complaining about equalization as being our burden, despite how equalization actually works, as there appears to be, Alberta subsidizing the rest of the country to some extent. So, that would be my thought on that.
One thing too is Carney going to side with Smith or Eby? I think it's important to point out in British Columbia there is not universal opposition to a pipeline. Like it's a much more dynamic kind of political environment than Alberta, which is just massive support for that. And so it's not like he's making a kind of zero-sum choice. Either he alienates Alberta or British Columbia, in which case definitely alien Alberta. That makes sense. But yeah, BC, this is it's not like a consensus on this in BC. It's a more interesting choice for him than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, that's fair.
I wasn't
And
I wasn't correcting you, Lisa, by the way. I just thought
No, but
put
it's
that
a
on.
good point, right? Yeah.
I think the only thing I could add is I don't think it would be a specific project or industry or symbolic thing. It would be if the Carney government somehow loses its ability to manage its relationships with Quebec and Ontario. Like it's getting along remarkably well with Premier Ford right now. Quebec is in its own odd place, but it's a quite Quebec-centric cabinet and party leadership, and in some ways a quite kind of Quebec Inc. style of economic policy. I think it would be if something tipped there where two of those provinces become very confrontational with the federal government. There's a lot more kind of strategic opportunity for Danielle Smith or Scott Moe on a bad day to kind of have a reason to go down that road. So I do think that piece is something interesting to watch. We are at the time where I ought to thank Lisa and Royce for taking the time and the conversation and for the great set of questions from the audience. And that's genuine. I've had a lot of fun. So yay them for hanging out in Central Standard Time and all that entails this time of year. As a little plug, the next lecture in this State of Canada series will feature Shannon Proudfoot. So for those of you in Saskatoon, you'll be able to come in person to that. The rest of the world can hang out online late in February. So we are excited about that. There's our usual run of other presentations if you're on our list serve that I encourage you to do. And on that note, I hope you have a very good and non-alienated afternoon, regardless of where in the West you are.